Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Armstrong. I'm a Research Fellow with the Australian Gambling Research Centre based at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. Thank you for attending my talk today about gambling activity in Australia. Before I begin, there's still time to register for the Australian Institute of Family Studies conference in July. It's all about what matters most to families in the 21st century, and there'll be presentations on gambling and family violence, promotion to children, and emerging gambling products. It'll be held at the Melbourne Conference Centre, so it's just around the corner. Okay, first I want to start with a brief overview of what national gambling activity has looked like over the past few decades. This will give you a broad sense of what gambling activity looked like until recently and where activity is probably headed. By gambling activity, I mean participation and expenditure on the gambling products common to most prevalent surveys and which account for most of Australia's gambling revenue. The overview is focused on annual activity and is published in a paper with the Journal of Gambling Studies, which I've referenced on the final slide. Second, and for the majority of the lecture, I'll talk in depth about what national gambling activity among regular gamblers looks like right now. Regular gamblers are the focus because they are the group containing the biggest number of participants, the biggest consumers, and therefore the gamblers most vulnerable to potential harm. This information in part 2 is all published in a report on our website, which, like the paper, is referenced on this final slide. As well, a recording of the presentation will be hosted on the Foundation's website, which you're looking at right now, in fact. So let's begin. Part 1. Two large comparable national gambling surveys were performed in Australia covering 1998 and 2011. And as you can see, the proportion of Australian adults who gamble annually dropped by around 20% over those two time points. However, the adult population grew by a similar proportion over that period, from 14 million to 17 million people. This means that despite a big drop in the participation rate, the number of adults gambling actually remained about the same, at about 11 million people over the period. Now, while the number of people gambling remained about the same over the last decade or so, what people are gambling on shifted markedly. As shown by the activities listed on the left, games of luck are declining in popularity. These include lotto products, instant scratch tickets, keno, bingo, and particularly electronic gaming machines or poker machines. As shown on the right, participation numbers are increasing in activities where knowledge or skill is perceived to influence the outcome. And these include casino table games, race betting, and particularly sports betting. This is a notable shift because poker machines, which are understood to be the most harmful form and which have been the main focus of research and policy and service provision for the past 2 decades, are declining steeply in popularity, declining from 5 million to 3 million people over that period. However, all three skill-based forms, casino games, race and sports betting, which are increasing in popularity, are considered harmful as well. Public policy, regulation, service provider and staff training to prevent and mitigate harm will need to broaden their focus on poker machines to include these skill-based forms, particularly race betting, which has overtaken poker machines in popularity, and which around 4 million Australians gamble on each year. So they're the participation trends in brief. What about expenditure? Well, as you can see, gambling expenditure in Australia rose markedly in the 90s, and this followed from substantial liberalisation of gambling, where laws were relaxed in many states allowing poker machines into pubs and clubs, and casinos were allowed to set up shop in most capital cities. Like gambling participation numbers, total expenditure plateaued and appears to have remained about the same since the late 90s, at around $22 to $24 billion. Now, gamblers and their families overwhelmingly report that gambling-related harm mostly results from financial losses. And internationally, Australia has ranked as the largest spending nation per capita on gambling in the world since at least the early 2000s. This would suggest that compared to the rest of the world, Australian gamblers are at disproportionately high risk of harm. And by the trends in per capita spending shown in the graph above from The Economist publication, our ranking as the highest risk nation has only become more entrenched over the past 2 decades. To put that gambling expenditure into context, Australians spend 50% more on gambling each year than on alcohol or tobacco, and nearly as much as on clothing and footwear. Poker machines in hotels and clubs are the real driver behind the rise and plateau in gambling expenditure. Poker expenditure recently peaked at around $12 billion, accounting for 50% of total Australian gambling revenue. And this may be considered a worry because, as I showed a few slides earlier, participation numbers have declined dramatically, yet expenditure has not fallen. Indeed, while the participation rate halved between the two national surveys in 1998 and 2011, expenditure per poker machine gambler doubled in the same period from around $2,000 to $4,000 a year. This indicates that despite being the most heavily scrutinised and regulated product over the last few decades, policy to minimise harm for this product has not been effective and needs a serious rethink. The next highest gambling expenditures are on racing and casino gaming, currently $3 and $5 billion each. They account for 12 and 20% of total gambling revenue respectively. Together, EGMs, race betting and casino gaming count for about 85% of industry revenue. Note that if you exclude casino EGM expenditure from the equation and look at casino table gaming only, you'll find that table gaming expenditure is similar to race betting expenditure. They are relatively on par, give or take a small amount for some other activity that goes on in the casino in addition to casino table gaming. The combination of participation and expenditure trends for racing and casino table games suggests that any financial harms associated with play have not overly changed in the past decade. That stands in rather strong contrast to participation and expenditure trends in EGM use, which suggests that the risks to users have increased substantially. Not to be discounted is the rise and rise of sports betting, and it's the new kid on the gambling block. You'd expect by the saturation of advertising you've been exposed to and the attention it's received in media and public debate that it would account for a substantial chunk of gambling revenue. Yet at around $900 million, it constitutes a humble 4% of Australian gambling revenue. It generates only around a third of the revenue that is generated by racing or casino table games. What it is, however, is by far and away the fastest growing source of revenue. In just the last year of revenue data collection, expenditure grew by around 28%. And this is the expenditure we know about, spending on Australian-based operators. Much of sports betting takes place online, so a sizable yet unknown proportion is spent on offshore sites. So, here are the expenditure levels on what are considered the four riskiest products in the same graph. Together they account for about 90% of expenditure on gambling in Australia. No product comes close to EGMs. Casino gaming comes next, followed by race betting. Sports betting has now made an appearance on the radar. Okay, so I've touched on trends in participation and expenditure, but I haven't told you what's going on with gambling problems. Whether the number of Australians experiencing problems rose or fell over the last 2 decades, between the 2 time points of the national survey, is unknown. This is because no national study has used the same methodology twice. Simply put, they've asked somewhat different people, somewhat different gambling questions in each survey, making comparisons between surveys rather difficult. Likewise, very few state prevalence surveys have used the same methodology over time, even within the same state, so we can't just add up all the state data to get the sense of national picture either. We're now very fortunate to have the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia's survey, HILDA, to provide us with some continuity. The 2015 HILDA survey provides us with the latest national problem gambling figures. It shows us that an estimated 1.4 million Australians, or 8% of the adult population, experienced gambling-related problems in 2015. That is, their gambling behaviour had either caused or put them at risk of harm. This included 700,000 Australians with low-level problems, nearly 500,000 with moderate-level problems, and 200,000 people with severe problems classified as problem gamblers. The most common problems were betting on more than one could afford to lose and returning on another day to try and win back money lost. Of course, this is measured on the PGSI. The HILDA survey actually provides us with one of the world's best sources of data connecting regular gambling activity to people's life circumstances. It commenced in 2001 and is a large, nationally representative study of the same Australian households over time. It provides data on a wide range of people's personal circumstances. For example, their history of income and employment, wealth accumulation, their credit card debt, their family size, their relationship status and their mental and physical health. Gambling questions were included for the first time in 2015, connecting gambling activity to these broad areas of life. It means that we have data connecting regular gambling activity in 2015 to participants' life circumstances stretching back 14 years. It's likely that the gambling questions will be asked every 4 years, meaning that the next year that they're asked is 2019. We hope. HILDA will use the same rigorous methodology each time, providing gambling statistics that are comparable over time and into the future. Now let me tell you a little bit about the HILDA gambling module itself. The gambling module comprises 2 sets of questions. The first set of questions asks participants, in a typical month, roughly how much do you spend on each of 10 different gambling activities? The focus on a typical month ensures that the focus is on regular gamblers and thus effectively excludes the occasional or once-off expenditure as well as occasional gamblers. The focus on a typical month also ensures that the focus is on usual monthly expenditure, like the amount you would usually spend on food or bills. So it doesn't include those horrible months where everything went wrong and one accidentally gambled away the food or bill money. It therefore does not reflect total expenditure on each product. Far from it. It ostensibly reflects something like planned or expected expenditure. And only on regular activities, not one-off splurges like on Melbourne Cup Day, for instance. The second set of questions comprise the Problem Gambling Severity Index. This, as I'm sure you know, includes 9 questions used to identify people whose gambling behaviour caused them problems or put them at risk of problems on a continuum of increasing severity. I'm now going to talk with you about our analysis of regular gamblers in the HILDA survey data, which is published in the report Gambling Activity in Australia. We're going to look at how many Australians gamble regularly, what activities they prefer, who they are, how much they spend, how many experience problems, and how gambling fits into their household budget. So, how many Australians gamble regularly? As shown in the top row, around 7 million Australians, or 40% of all adults, gambled regularly in 2015. That is, they spent money on one or more of 10 gambling activities during a typical month. Lottery was the most common activity, with 5 million Australians regularly buying lotto, lottery or pools tickets in a typical month. Other common activities were the regular purchase of instant scratch tickets and the playing of EGMs by around 1.5 million each month. 1 million people also made regular race bets, while just over 500,000 people made sports bets or played poker. Least likely to be a typical monthly event were casino table gaming, bingo, private betting and poker, with less than 200,000 Australians participating. So how many activities did they gamble on, and what activities did they prefer? Broadly speaking, 62%, or around 4.2 million regular gamblers, participated in a single activity. 38%, or around 2.6 million regular gamblers, participated in multiple regular activities. Looking at the top row, we found that around 60% of lottery players participated regularly in lottery-type products alone. On the other hand, more than 70% of participants in any other activity participated regularly in multiple activities. For instance, Keno players at the bottom very rarely spent money on that activity alone in a typical month. Only 10% did. This table shows which additional activities were regularly played. The table is read from left to right. The extent to which participants in one activity, shown in the left column, participated in any other activity is shown in the remaining columns. I'll put a few boxes around the points I'm going to refer to. Recall from the previous slide that only 10% of Keno players participated regularly in that activity alone. Looking at Keno here, in the left column and reading across the row, we can see that the most common additional activities of regular Keno players were lotteries, which 67% regularly played, and EGMs, which 48% also regularly played. One broad pattern we observed in the data was that people either gambled on lotteries alone or a mix of products, which often included lotteries. Another pattern was that people who gambled on one risky activity were inclined to gamble on certain other risky activities. For instance, regular casino table game players were also likely to gamble regularly on EGM and race betting. Race bettors were also likely to gamble on sports and EGMs. A particularly common activity pairing was sports and race betting. 57% of sports bettors also bet regularly on the races. Notably, though, only a third of race bettors also placed regular sports bets. In other words, race betting was more common amongst sports bettors than sports betting was amongst race bettors. Many pairings, of course, reflect the environments in which the activities are found together. For instance, EGMs were popular among Keno players, both of which are commonly found in the pub or club together. Likewise, lotteries were popular among regular instant scratch ticket players, both found at the newsagent. So there's a wealth of information in this table. The most important take-home message for me from these data was to realise that when we talk about people who are regularly gambling on a particular product, such as EGMs or sports, we're very likely talking about people who are gambling on a cluster of activities, not just the one that we're absorbed in. Their pleasure and pain comes from the full milieu of gambling activities in which they are involved. So, let's have a quick look at who the regular gamblers are. I'll stick to outlining the standout characteristics of regular consumers of lottery-type products, which were the most popular, and consumers of the higher risk products, EGMs, race betting, sports betting, and casino table games, which together constitutes most of Australian gambling revenue. I've listed the standout characteristics for these products on the left and the percentage of participants as well as the Australian population who share these characteristics on the right. The top lines in the graph above show us that among lottery players there was a high proportion of people aged 50 and over that you'd find in the Australian population. That is, 58% of lottery players were aged 50 and over, whereas only 43% of the Australian population were aged 50 and over. This means that people aged 50 plus are overrepresented among regular lottery players. People with low levels of schooling, who are retired, married, and who had no children living with them were also overrepresented amongst lottery players. EGM players shared similarities with lottery players in terms of being overrepresented among older and retired Australians with lower education levels and no children at home. They were different in that, relative to the Australian population, a high proportion of EGM players were Indigenous, lived in an regional area, had low incomes and drew their main source of income from welfare. Race bettors were likewise overrepresented amongst older Australians with lower education levels and no children at home. They were different in that they were overwhelmingly male and that there was a higher proportion who were full-time workers who lived in outer regional or remote areas and had a high income relative to the Australian population. Sports bettors were also overwhelmingly male. A higher proportion had high incomes as well and worked full-time. Unlike race bettors, though, sports bettors were overrepresented amongst younger Australians who had higher education levels, who were identified as Indigenous, and those who were single. Those who played casino table games regularly were again overwhelmingly male. However, almost half were under 30 years of age. They were overrepresented by people who had completed high school, who worked full-time and were single. A high proportion lived with multiple adults, whether they be part of a mature family in which the adults had grown up and were still living with their parents, or in a share house. They also were overrepresented amongst people who lived in major cities in a high socioeconomic area, which is indicative of living in a major city. 5% were Indigenous compared to 2% of the Australian population who were Indigenous. The take-home message from these findings is that regular gamblers are a somewhat heterogeneous bunch. Their profiles can be quite different depending on the product or product clusters you're looking at. Public health messaging, interventions and regulation could benefit from considering these differences when targeting their populations of interest. For example, player-operated pre-commitment systems found on Victorian EGMs need to cater for the high proportion of older players who didn't finish high school, so the system can't be too whiz-bang techy or fancy. Any consideration of safe expenditure limits for EGMs likewise needs to account for the fact that 30% of regular EGM players draw on welfare as their main source of income. Very little margin for overspending. Having got a sense of the characteristics of regular gamblers and a few of the products, we turn to their spending habits. To reiterate from earlier, participants were asked, roughly speaking, how much do you spend in a typical month on 10 different gambling activities? So this is typical or usual monthly expenditure and not total monthly expenditure. We then multiplied participants' responses by 12 to get a sense of what their expenditure would look like in a typical year without any atypical months. Shown in the bottom row, the average gambler's typical monthly gambling expenditure amounted to a total of around $1,272 over the year. The remainder of the graph shows the average past year expenditure by regular gamblers on each of the various activities. For each activity, the purple bar shows participants' average gambling outlay in total, remembering that they often gambled on multiple products, while the pink bar shows their average expenditure on the activity in question. Across the various activity participants, scratchy players spent the least. Located at the top of the chart, the pink bar shows that those who participated regularly in this activity typically spent $248 on scratchy over the year, while the purple bar shows that they spent around $600 on gambling overall. In other words, scratchies accounted for around 40% of regular scratchy players' overall gambling expenditure. At the other end of the chart, poker players spent the most. They spent around $1,800 on poker and spread a similar amount across their other activities, in total spending over $3,600 on gambling during the year. Beyond poker, the highest average expenditures and total gambling outlays were among people who gambled regularly on the higher risk products, including casino table games, race betting, and EGMs and sports betting, with their typical yearly expenditures on each of these products in excess of $1,000 and their total yearly gambling outlays in excess of $2,000. The take-home message here is that regular gamblers often spread their money across a range of activities. So if we focus solely on the activity on which they spent the most money, we're often only capturing about half of what they usually spent on gambling overall. What was interesting when we looked across the activities was that while the profiles of the participants in each activity may have been quite different, the high spenders on each activity were in many cases quite similar. Those who spent significantly more than the average of $1,272 were likely to be male, have a maximum 10 years of schooling, be employed full-time, single, and live with multiple adults. Those who spent less than average were likely to be aged 30 to 49, have a university degree, and live with their children. The average spend per gambler was otherwise quite similar between those with different socio-demographic characteristics. And this was a surprise, because this means that regular gamblers on low incomes spent as much on gambling as those with high incomes. And those whose income mainly came from a wage spent as much on gambling as those whose income came from welfare, which is a good introduction to gambling problems. So, how many regular gamblers experienced gambling problems? Among the estimated 6.8 million regular gamblers in Australia, 1.1 million, or 17%, experienced one or more problems. A bit more than half of those affected experienced low-level problems, while nearly half experienced moderate to severe problems. Now, what activities do gamblers with problems prefer? Well, this graph shows the proportion of regular gamblers who participated regularly in more than one activity each month. It shows that the majority of people without problems participated in a single activity, whereas the majority of people with problems gambled on multiple activities. We further found that compared to any other activity, lotteries had the largest number of participants with problems. That is, almost 700,000 regular lotto, lottery and pools players had experienced gambling problems in the past year. 600,000 EGM players and 400,000 regular race bettors had also experienced problems. Very few people with problems played bingo, poker, casino table games, or private betting. In this chart, we turned those same numbers into the proportion of regular participants in each activity who did and did not experience gambling problems. Here you can see that lotteries and scratchies actually had the lowest proportions of players with problems. Those 700,000 lottery players with problems constituted only 13% of regular participants in that activity. However, 1 in 3 or more, so 33% or more, of regular participants in every other activity experienced problems, including those who participated in bingo. Indeed, nearly half of regular monthly participants in sports or race betting, EGMs, private betting, table games or poker had experienced gambling problems in the year. These rates, to me, are remarkable. A take-home message from me from these participant statistics was that both participant problem numbers and rates are useful to consider side by side, otherwise key elements of the story will be missed. For instance, people with problems constitute only a small portion of those who regularly participate in the lotteries, but at the same time, because of its enormous popularity, lotteries attracted the largest number of people with problems. Lotteries may therefore be a great product through which to communicate with problem gamblers and do so without stigma, since so many non-problem gamblers participate as well. Likewise, just because poker, casino table games and private betting attracted some of the lowest numbers of regular gamblers with problems, they should not be ignored. People with problems constitute a very high proportion of regular gamblers on these products. Any thoughts of relaxing regulation around less popular products like poker or table gaming need to account for the fact that their regular customers constitute the most vulnerable gambling populations of all, despite these populations being small. So, who experienced problems? Who are they? What differentiates people with problems from those without? Those with problems are more likely to be male, aged 18 to 29, Indigenous, unemployed, single, renting, living in a low socioeconomic area, have a low income and draw their main source of income from welfare payments. These differences illustrate a classic risk profile seen across much of the public health literature. These characteristics commonly describe people more likely to engage in harmful consumption of alcohol, tobacco, illegal and prescription drugs, fast food, sugary drinks and so forth. On the other hand, those without problems are more likely to live with their partner and children, have a mortgage, have a university degree and be retired. They're more likely to have achieved life milestones we hold in high regard. No surprises there. Now I'm sure you'd like to know what gamblers with problems spent their money on. This chart shows the proportion of total typical expenditure by regular gamblers on each activity accounted for by those with and without gambling problems. First, let's look at the middle row of this table, labelled all gambling. As shown on the left side of the row in pink, people without problems accounted for 58% of all typical gambling expenditure. Those with problems, the minority, constituting 17% of regular gamblers, accounted for 42% of all typical expenditure. Looking at the top of the chart, we can see that people with problems accounted for 2/3 of the money spent on table games and EGMs, and the majority of money spent on sports and race betting and private betting. On the other hand, people without problems accounted for most of the money spent on lotteries, scratchies and bingo. This chart shows how much regular gamblers, on average, spent when we sum their typical monthly expenditures on all regular activities together for the year, and it presents this by level of problems. Those with no problems spent around $900 on gambling in a typical year. Those with low-level problems spent around $2,000. Those with moderate-level problems, $3,500, and those with severe problems around $6,000 overall. Think about these figures when considering safe expenditure limits. Think about also the income that people are earning and the relativity of this expenditure to that income. Now this chart shows how much regular gamblers with different levels of problems typically spend, on average, on a selection of activities over the year. It shows in orange expenditure on gambling overall by the respective activity participants, and in red, spending on the activity in question. It shows that those with problems spend a lot more on other activities in addition to their expenditure on any particular activity. Look at problem gamblers who participated in EGMs, race or sports betting, for instance. As shown in red, they all spent close to $4,000 each, on average, on those single activities. However, they spent a lot on other activities as well. In fact, problem gamblers who participated in sports betting had the biggest gambling outlay of all participants at nearly $10,000 on average for the year. Huge. But less than half of this overall outlay went on sports betting. Same was true for sports bettors who had low and moderate level problems as well. In other words, sports betting expenditure was responsible for less than half of any financial problems caused by their typical monthly gambling expenditure. This highlights the importance of accounting for expenditure on all activities when looking for the causes of gambling-related financial harm. Any study or harm prevention program that focuses purely on a single activity is likely only addressing part of a problem gambler's problem. In this final section, it's only a few slides, we're going to look at what proportion of regular gamblers' households' disposable income was spent on gambling. Note that we are looking at disposable income, that is income after tax, and total household income, that is the income of everyone in the household added together. In the above table, we have Australian gamblers' households partitioned into 5 income groups, from lowest to highest total household income. Each group represents 20% of all Australian households containing a regular gambler. At the lowest end, 20% of gambling households bring in less than $38,000 in income over the year after tax. At the highest end, 20% of gambling households bring in more than $132,000 in income over the year after tax. Remember, that's the income of everybody in the house added together. Now, the pink bar shows the average proportion of total household disposable income spent on gambling for each of the 5 income groups. You can see that gamblers in low-income households spent a much greater proportion of their household's income on gambling. On average, they spent 10% of the income that came in on gambling, whereas those in the highest income households spent just 1%. Taking this a step further, when we looked at the risk groups among these households, we found that non-problem gamblers in low-income households spent on average about 5% of their total household income on gambling. Those with low and moderate level problems spent 8 and 12% of their income on gambling. Problem gamblers spent around 26% of their household members' combined income after tax on gambling within low-income households. And recall that this is just reflecting expenditure in a typical month on gambling. Not a bad month, and not on activities that one did less regularly that may have splurged a substantial amount on at some point during the year. In contrast, in the higher income households, problem gamblers spent only 3 to 4% of household income on gambling. You can imagine then that the types of harms caused by gambling would be quite different between low and high income households. In low income households, the harms would presumably relate more to financial issues. In high income households, the notable harms might relate more to other things, such as work or relationship disruption. Recall as well that low income earners are overrepresented among EGM players, and high income earners are overrepresented among sports and race bettors. Together, these data suggest that the different products may very well be related to different types of gambling-related harm. These findings have ramifications for potential public health interventions. For instance, for the development of safe spending limits, which if fixed to a single value, may really only be relevant to lower income households, say 20% or even 40% of gamblers. We need more research to better understand this. Now, you've seen a lot of slides containing a lot of graphs at a rapid rate. It's dense stuff. Don't worry. You can always press pause or rewind and go back and have a look. I'm going to wrap up now with some of the most important things that I personally learned from this study. 1, regular gamblers on any product except lotteries are likely to be gambling on multiple products and spread their money across these products. We simply cannot focus on one activity such as EGMs or sports betting if we are to fully understand and fully intervene on the source of people's gambling problems. 2, certain activities cluster together, such as EGMs and Keno, sports and race betting, and attract people with particular characteristics. Public health interventions need to account for these varied consumer profiles to target policy and programs effectively. 3, few studies have looked at product-level problem prevalence rates or the number of participants with problems. We found that both the number of people experiencing problems and prevalence of gambling problems amongst product participants are valuable to examine. One might otherwise overlook the vulnerability of the poker-playing population or the potential usefulness of lotteries as an unstigmatised contact point with the majority of problem gamblers. 4, more than 40% of regular participants in sports or race betting, EGMs, private betting, table games or poker experience gambling problems. That seems to me a huge proportion and needs to be more widely talked about and cited. Is it acceptable that nearly every second punter who regularly walks in the venue door is likely to be harmed by gambling during the year? Where should we draw the line and how and why? The PGSI 1, $1,000 expenditure. We need to have this discussion. Finally, the differences in gambling expenditure between lower and higher income households suggest that harm likely manifests differently across the socioeconomic spectrum. That is, financial harm may be more relevant to lower income households, whereas other forms of harm may be more relevant in higher income households. This needs investigation so as to identify product-specific harm and target potential interventions such as safe spending limits effectively for consumers who constitute both low and high income earners. In conclusion, the HILDA survey data now provides extensive information on national gambling activity. Our findings have provided new and important information about how many Australians gamble regularly, what activities they prefer, who they are, how much they spend, how many experience problems, and how gambling fits into their household budget. Future HILDA waves will provide longitudinal data with which to disentangle the different factors that both influence and are a consequence of gambling behaviours. Thank you.